What should be included in the equipment expense of the budget in a grant application? That's the question we're looking at today. And we're looking at this both from a defining equipment point of view, estimating cost, as well as the justification and sort of the strategy around the justification of it. So I'm Benjamin Dean from grantgetting.com. I hope you enjoy this video and others like it on the channel aimed at helping you get more grants. There is a link in the description for 10 tips relating to equipment budgeting for your grant projects. Let's jump in with three main topics we're going to talk about today. The first is defining equipment. So many times I have seen there be a particular number on a grant application FAQ or RFA that says this is what we mean by equipment. It is a thing that costs more than $5,000. Okay. There are some times on medium-sized and certainly larger grant opportunities where you will have a more detailed definition of what is meant by equipment, typically including the lifespan of that particular item. But typically, equipment refers to any item that has a longer lifespan than the project term, 12 months. And it is integral to your project. Unlike supplies, which are typically consumed during the project, equipment is a durable good or something that is typically going to show up on your books as a fixed asset. Something like computer, lab equipment, machines that will be used for the project that you are articulating in your grant, but also for other uses down the line. It is something that will depreciate over time and will need to be accounted for in that sense in your books. When you're putting together your budget, before you put together your grant budget, when you're putting together your program budget, you want to be specific about what equipment you will need. For example, if you're applying for funding for a tech-driven program, you might include the computers or specialized technical tools, and that would be something that you would need for that project, but you're not going to throw it away at the end of the project. You're going to keep it and you're going to use it for future projects. Funders want to see that you've thought out exactly what's required for your project success. Now, when we look at the word required, this is where you have some conflict because many times a piece of equipment on one hand is really, really, really helpful. And it's going to ensure increased efficiency, increased outputs, a lot of increases in productivity. But in many cases, you could probably still do the project without it. And if that's the case, then you just need to know, at least on an estimate level, what that difference is. So if you have an upgrade in your program budget, an upgrade of your facilities, and there's a piece of equipment that is part of that upgrade. Well, it's likely that you'll still be able to continue that program without it, but on a scaled back sense. Okay, so just do some estimates to say, imagine if you get invited to the interview for the grant and they say, we see that you have this piece of equipment in here. You've got a total budget of $150,000 and this one piece of equipment is $25,000. It's a big part of the budget. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this equipment is going to do for you? What you want to be able to do is say this equipment will increase our efficiency by X, or this piece of equipment will allow us to reach X number of new clients, or this piece of equipment will allow us to increase our output, whether it's an event, number of volunteers, number of clients, whatever that is, by a certain percentage or a certain number, right? This is our estimate for what this equipment will allow us to do. And what I have found is that being transparent and open when you have these situations where a piece of equipment isn't required, but it's really, really, really helpful, that you just are transparent about it, that you don't pretend that, oh, we just can't do this project. We can't do it without this piece of equipment. If you don't fully fund our application, we are not going to do this. right? There's a way to do that without doing that. Okay, and that's more of the budget strategy overall. The equipment is a big part of it because that is something that there's going to be more eyeballs onto on the grant review team and certainly on the funder, allocation team, is that they don't want fraud, of course, but they don't also want to be purchasing things that are very indirectly involved in the actual project. And equipment is one of those things that might be put in there because it helps the project a little bit, but you really need it for another project or you need it for a longer period of time. Okay. So, what I was referencing with the budget strategy is something I'll just mention here as a tangent, which is that you want to give, of course, the funder the impression that it would be valuable for them to fully fund your request. But at the same time, you don't want to be, you know, lying. You don't want to be somewhat untruthful because really good program managers and really good organizations always figure it out. They might figure it out on a scaled back version, but they're going to achieve their mission. And that's what funders want to see. They don't want to see an organization coming in and saying, unless you give us this money, we're out of luck. Right? We got nobody else. You're the only one. You're the only application we're putting in, and we don't have any other support. Yuck. That's not a very strong organization. Conversely, you don't want to come across and say, we got plenty of money. We don't need your money. You can give it to us if you want, but really doesn't make any difference to us, right? So there's a little bit of sort of strategy in the middle. And the tactic that typically works is to create your budget with flexible funders that can come in and out to fund remainders. So as to say, if you've got a budget of $50,000 for a project, and if you can find a few individuals or other granting organizations that can say, hey, we can fill in the gaps of your budget, then you can, on a proactive basis, estimate what that filling the gap would mean if you were to receive a full amount from a particular grantor. So as to say, you've got a budget for a program of $50,000. So here's the example, $50,000 to run a program over 12 months. You have $10,000 already gained, already committed by another organization. So you got 40. Then you've got a grant opportunity of 25, and that's the grant that you're writing. So that's 10 plus 25, that's 35, right? So you've got a $15,000 gap in that sense if you were to be fully funded on that 25. If you've got funders that are willing to put in $15,000 or more, let's say it's 20,000 that you've got a group of funders that are willing to put in, then as you put in your revenue side of the budget for this $25,000 grant, you can legitimately show that you have $10,000 committed from this grant program. You have $15,000 committed from these individuals, perhaps they're even anonymous, and you have a budgetary gap of $25,000. This grant will fully fund this program. Okay, you are applying to close the gap in the funding required to do the things that we're doing in this grant application. That's one way to quantitatively get at, we want your money, we need your money, but look, we've already had success in raising funds for this. If we don't receive your money, and we're in a conversation, we're in an interview, and you can say this, if we don't receive full funding, we're very confident we're going to be able to go out there and raise it, but it's going to be more effort and it's not guaranteed. It might delay our start point and it might decrease the numbers of outputs or outcomes that we're going to have. Okay, so that's sort of the grant strategy side of that as a tangent upon a conversation that is likely to happen with equipment. Okay, so point 2, estimating equipment costs accurately. So just as with anything that you need a quote on, there is typically a time horizon for that quote. So if you have a piece of equipment that you need, you're writing a grant in April, The grant's due in May. You get your quote in April. You submit your grant proposal at the end of May. You don't hear about it until July, and you don't get your funding until August or September, right? So you've got almost a half a year between the time you went to that individual or that company and got that quote to the time where you can now turn around and say, okay, I have the money, I want to buy it now, right? Guess what's going to happen? It's probably going to increase in cost, okay? What's also going to happen more probably than even the increase in cost is that when you get that quote, there's going to be a time horizon on it. 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. This quote is good for 60 days. Well, you know that after those 60 days, it's going to be likely that the cost is going to increase. So you want to try to estimate for that. And I would, if possible, allocate an additional percentage based upon that conversation you have with that vendor on what they anticipate the cost being. You can include the quote, and you need to include the quote in your budget justification or in your uploads as to justifying it. But you can also include an email conversation as part of that says, the manufacturer says it's going to be about 10% more, we estimate, in September. Okay, so you got your quote, you got that, it's 10%. You've got a reason to increase that cost item. That's a little detailed, but those are things that I have seen organizations get money in for a piece of equipment that requires installation and additional work, electrical, plumbing, whatever the case is, in order to install it. And they got quotes on everything, but there was this big delay. They got their money, and the cost of every contractor needed to do that increased in some cases by 15 or 20%. And they no longer had the money to do it. Right? They were able to figure out how to complete that project on a scaled down basis without the equipment, but that's a problem. And it potentially could have been avoided by increasing that amount in the budget with an estimate from that manufacturer. Okay, and you want to also account for any additional costs like shipping, I mentioned installation, and if possible, one of the biggest expenses that are forgotten about with equipment is maintenance. Okay, regular maintenance. Even the warranty work doesn't always come free, right? It sometimes comes with the travel costs not included, or only labor, not parts, or only parts, not labor, right? So you do need to dig in and understand that, because in some budgets, you can include maintenance as part of the equipment expense. 12 months of maintenance, an estimate on what it's going to cost to maintain it. Now, what does it mean to maintain it? Sometimes that means going out with a third-party contractor and getting a quote, or hiring somebody to come in and service the piece of equipment or whatever the case is. You can also think about it as a computer. What does it take to maintain a computer? A maintenance cost might be, depending on the grant budget, antivirus software that you install and you run, and there's a cost associated with that maintenance. It might be a tech person coming in and reviewing it every 3 or 4 months to clean it up, to upgrade the memory, whatever the case is. All of those things can sometimes be included in the equipment cost, and I have included them in there and gotten the maintenance covered. Okay, so it's just thinking very strategically about it. If you're budgeting for new laptops, you don't want to include just the base price. Think about if you need the software, which is technically you can make that part of the equipment if you want an upgraded warranty, and of course the maintenance. You want to provide funders with a clear, detailed breakdown of each cost so that they know exactly where their money is going. How many quotes do you get? The rule of thumb is 3. Okay, for multiple reasons. You want to show the funder that you are shopping for the best price, for the best value with everything you're getting. You also want to have options if you do get the grant and it's 6 months later or 4 months later and you go to those vendors. One of them's out of business, one of them the price is 30% higher, and one of them they don't carry that product anymore, right? So you at least have one option for 30% higher. right? So those things happen all the time. Okay, then point 3 on equipment, and this is maybe even the most strategic of all the points, which is justification. When, by the nature of what equipment is, it will last longer than the project period. That is inherently part of what it is. But what I've seen in reviewing grant applications before that doesn't work is this sense of excitement around getting the piece of equipment because of all the other benefits that will come from that equipment that have nothing to do with the project's objectives or goals or outcomes. Okay, it is true that when you purchase a piece of equipment for a program, you will be able to use it for other things. And that is good, and that's a positive, and that's never going to be looked upon negatively in and of itself in a grant in the logic of buying equipment. But in a grant application, the purpose of the grant application isn't to tell the reviewer all the other things the equipment is going to do. It is just like supplies to be able to very directly justify it relative to the goals, objectives, milestones, outputs, outcomes, whatever's in there. Why is the equipment necessary for the project's success? Why is it necessary? You need to tie all the equipment directly to the project's outcomes and goals. Be clear how the equipment will help you do that and show that without it, your project wouldn't succeed or it wouldn't succeed to the same level. And be direct. If we don't purchase this piece of equipment, X will happen. If we do, Y will happen. Okay? Every piece of lab equipment for conducting experiments, every piece of computer software, every machine, everything that you can imagine that you will need, you need to have both sides of that equation ready. Okay, it's just a best practice. It makes your conversations easier. You know, you don't feel like you're trying to sneak something in. You don't feel like you're being dishonest. You don't feel any of that. If there's one piece of equipment that you need and you really, really need it, and the project cannot happen without it, then say that. And that really needs to be elevated in your narrative. Because if there is a piece of equipment that fits that description and you don't really speak to that much, that outcome much in your narrative, it's going to be hard to justify it. Okay, so the equipment expense section of your grant budget, in this section, you got to clearly define things. You have to estimate your cost accurately, and the justification has to be strategic. Thinking about it's you and the budget and the project sort of description. You're sitting down with one other person and you're going line by line, and you get to that equipment, that big equipment cost. You've got to have a very clear answer as to why it's needed. Okay, so there's a free download with 10 tips on budgeting equipment expenses in the grant application down in the description of this video. Check that out. And if you have any questions about equipment expenses when you're putting together your budget, leave a comment and I'd be happy to help. Thank you for jumping into this video, and we will see you in the next one.